Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for coming. What I'd like to do today, first I'd like to just go through a few recent advances in this field, because it's a very rapidly moving field. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of AI and deep learning and how these models came about. And finally, I'd like to start a discussion about the kind of threats and challenges that this technology potentially poses. So this is a list of some of the areas where there's been big advances in recent years. So, game playing is one area where AI has advanced. So this Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in 1996. And more recently, there's been AlphaGo and AlphaGo Zero. And after that, AlphaStar. So AlphaStar was a project from Google DeepMind, which to play a game called StarCraft, which is a real-time strategy game. And this was a huge project with about 50 engineers working on it, and it involves, some logic and tactics and coordination between units. And it involves not just sort of selecting a move, but selecting an area of the screen and choosing a certain action and so on. So this is kind of the advancement of game playing. There's also been big advances in medical imaging and diagnosis. So systems which will scan different parts of the body and try to find tumors and other diverticulitis and various other things. So that's having a huge impact on medical treatment and also basic research. So there's this system called AlphaFold, and the team who developed this won the Nobel Prize last year for chemistry. This is a system which predicts the way proteins will fold. Proteins get built up from amino acids, and then they fold up into a certain geometry, and it's been a long-standing challenge to try to predict what shape things would fold up into. And they made a big advance with this, and this is having huge impacts in medicine. And they're also using similar techniques to look at inorganic compounds. So lots and lots of hypothetical compounds that have never been studied before, and they use machine learning to try to predict the properties of those compounds. And if they search through 2 million theoretical compounds, they may find a few that have very useful properties. Then you're probably all familiar with text and code generation. So the ChatGPT is being used for all kinds of different purposes, and also code. So people who write software, there are systems that you just kind of roughly describe what kind of software you want, and it'll produce software for you. And then usually you have to kind of correct it or make some changes, but it's improving constantly. Sorry about that. Don't worry about me. And okay, so that's language processing. And then what about image processing? Well, this kind of started in 2012 with image classification, where you give an image and have to say what is it an image of. Then we move on to object detection. So there's a system called YOLO, which it can actually kind of analyze video in real time and pick out most of the objects in the image. I mean, it misses a few, but it picks out the objects in the image and identifies them. And so we have image processing and we have language processing, and then we have what's called multimodal AI. So this combines image and language. So one example of this is that image captioning. So you give an image and it'll produce a caption for you. Usually pretty good. Sometimes it makes mistakes. here it says 2 young girls are playing with a Lego toy. I think that may be an adult. It's a bit hard to, or a teenager at least, it's a bit hard to say. It might be a mother and daughter. So it's not 100% foolproof, but it's pretty good generally. And then you can combine these things, combine the image the captioning with the image segmentation to get what we call dense image captioning. So here again, it's identifying objects, but it's also identifying components of those objects and saying something about the relationships between them. It's, quite simple in some ways, but that's the trunk of the elephant. It says, there's rocks on the ground, and the roof of a building, and so on. So this is just getting more and more kind of detailed. Oops. And then in the same realm, we have visual question answering. So I had a graduate student recently graduated who was working on this. You're given an image or a set of images, and then you ask a question, and it has to answer the question. So sometimes it's a yes or no answer. Sometimes the answer is a number, how many children are there. Sometimes it's a bit more sophisticated. It could be a one-word answer or even an explanation of something. So that's VQA. And finally, we get into the realm of robotics. So if you're trying to interact with a robot, you have to have a common discourse of just understanding of what you're talking about. So you get this kind of, you give it an instruction, but then it may have to clarify that instruction. So pick up the toy with a black and yellow face. So it'll pick up the penguin, pick up the blue soda can in the middle. So you specify spatial relationships and colors. There's 3 blue soda cans here. I wanted to pick the one in the middle. If there's an ambiguity, pick up the ball. So first of all, it recognizes that that's an apple and a tomato. They look quite like a ball, but it's smart enough to know that they're not balls. But these 3 are balls, and then it asks which ball you want. Do you mean the green tennis ball on the table? And the final thing, the other thing that's a hot topic at the moment is like agent AI. So this is where the AI is not just giving information, but actually sort of making decisions, and that's sort of getting people into a whole new realm. Yeah. So there's all this kind of exciting stuff going on. Now, I just want to go back through some of the history of this. So this kind of started in the 1940s with McCulloch and Pitts. They were studying individual neurons in the brain, and the neurons are quite complicated actually, the real neurons. The neuron is a cell, so it has all the things that a cell has. It has a cell body, and it has a nucleus, and it has mitochondria and all of that, but it has certain special other things that other cells wouldn't have. So most cells would be just round in shape, but a neuron has this kind of very jagged shape. It's called dendrites, which is from the Latin word for a tree. And then what happens is like electrical signals come in here from other neurons, and that builds up the voltage inside the cell body. Normally, so these connections can be excitatory or inhibitory. So if it's an excitatory connection, it means that the signal from the previous neuron will make it raise the voltage here. If it's inhibitory, then the signal from the other neuron will lower it. And then when the voltage reaches a certain threshold, the neuron will fire, and an electrical pulse will go along this thing called the axon, and then these axon terminals will connect with dendrites from another neuron. And so this is how like mental processing happens, is you can get a chain of firing neurons, neuron fire, several neurons firing and then causing other neurons to fire in a sequence. The neurons come in a variety of different shapes and configurations. This one is called a motor neuron because it's got the axon. Normally the axon would be very short in a neuron. It would only be about a centimeter or so. But with these motor neurons, the axon can be almost up to a meter in length. The reason for that is for safety. Like if you put your hand on a hot stove, you pull it away very quickly. So there's a very short chain going on there, that it just goes from one neuron in your finger up to your shoulder and up to the brain stem. And so you get these very long axons, and it's got a kind of myelinated sheath to prevent the charge from dispersing. But there's the more typical neurons would probably have a shorter axon. Anyway, McCulloch and Pitts looked into this, and they tried to come up with a mathematical model to capture the essential features of the neuron. Like I said, there's a lot of complexity here with chemistry and different kinds of chemicals and ion channels and different stuff like that. But they came up with this sort of simpler model where you have like inputs which represent the voltages coming from into the dendrites, and then you have these weights which are meant to represent these connections. So if the weight is positive, it's an excitatory connection, and if it's negative, it's an inhibitory connection. So you have this linear combination, and you add, like, you subtract off a threshold, and then you put the result through some transfer function, and you get an output. So this is like a artificial neuron. And this Frank Rosenblatt took this a step further. He said, well, can we take one of these artificial neurons and use it to do some task? The task he had in mind was simple character recognition. So this is the days, it's before the transistor. So it's the days when you had like vacuum tubes and all that stuff, and he has a very primitive like digital camera here, and so it sort of sees this image and converts it into like 20 by 20, so that's sort of 400 pixels, and you measure the illumination in each of those pixels, and then you have so it's just like this, except you have like 400, each of these represents one of the pixels in the image. And then you have some linear combination and the transfer function. And then to tell you which letter it is. So actually you have 26 different of these, like one just to recognize it, whether it's a C or not a C, and then another one whether it's an A or not an A. And he came up with an algorithm that would automatically choose like the weights for this network in order to do that task. So this is very, very early work in machine learning. Now, we go forward to the 1980s, then we start to have connections. So this perceptron is really a model of one neuron. And sorry, I should have said, in the brain, on average, each neuron receives connections from 10,000 other neurons. So there's actually a fairly high, there's like 1 billion neurons in your brain, and the number of connections is 10,000 higher. So there's quite a high connectivity. So in the 80s, Rumelhart, Hinton, and Williams started to put these things together. So, we have the inputs, and then we have a layer of these artificial neurons, and then what comes out of them goes to another layer of artificial neurons, and so on, and eventually you get an output. In the early days, there weren't too many layers. There might be sort of 2 or 3 layers. Later on, there are a lot more layers. But these people started to look at this, and they came up with another learning algorithm, which is kind of based on gradient descent, that would allow you to learn. And these things were more powerful. They could learn things that the single neuron was not able to learn. So then we move a bit forward to convolutional networks, and this was also based on studies of the brain. So this is work that was done in the late 50s and early 60s by Hubel and Wiesel. They were studying the primary visual cortex. So when you see the light hits your eyes and the signals go back, it hits the retina at the back of your eye, and then the signal goes along the optic nerve to the back of your head. That's where the primary visual cortex is. That's why if you get hit on the back of your head, sometimes you see kind of lights flashing before your eyes. And it's a little bit slightly disturbing, these kind of experiments, because they would get cats and they'd stick the cat in the apparatus, and then they'd stick a probe into its primary visual cortex so they could measure the activity of a single neuron, and they'd project an image onto the screen that the cat would look at, and they found that a particular neuron might only become active when the cat is looking at a line at a particular angle. And another neuron would only react if the line's at some other angle. And in fact, movement could be involved too. There might be a neuron that only fires if it's the line with a particular angle and moving in a particular direction. So there's layers in this cortex, and so in the first layer, the neurons respond to these sort of low-level features, and then in higher layers, these low-level features kind of get combined into more sophisticated features. So Jan LeCun, inspired by this, he came up with this thing called a convolutional neural network, and basically, again, it's built in layers, and it's based on the idea of repeated structure. So if you're looking for a certain feature, you've got these low-level filters or features that are looking for certain features in the image, and if you can look for a feature in one part of the image, or you can use the same weights to look for a feature in another part of the image. And so the idea that you recognize an object from individual lower features. I mean, it's a bit hard to understand exactly how it works, but if you're trying to recognize a bird, you might recognize like the eye of the bird and the beak and the feathers, and then you kind of combine them and you realize that it's a bird. So this was used for image classification, and then that was in 1998, and then you fast forward to 2012, and a PhD student of Jeff Hinton's called Alex Krosinski took this idea and just kind of scaled it up to a larger size, making use of sort of parallel hardware which had been developed in the meantime. And so I mean, LeCun was just trying to classify images from 10 different categories, and then there was this competition called the ImageNet competition, which a team of people collected 1 million images in 1,000 different categories. And there was a competition to see how well you could classify those images. And this Alex Krasinski built this convolutional neural network, and it achieved much greater, in 2012 at the competition, it achieved much greater accuracy than previous methods. Yeah, the previous methods could get about 66% accuracy, and he lifted it up to about 84 or 85. So this is really the kind of beginning of deep learning. And interestingly, you can try to look at what features are being extracted in this network. And what you see, this is like at the first layer, and then the second layer and the third layer. And interestingly, these low-level features are quite similar to what Hubel and Wiesel found. You know, they respond to lines at certain angles with certain colors. And then at the next level, it may be circles or curved things. And the resolution of this is not very good, but I think this is different parts of a motor car, you know, hubcaps and that kind of thing. So this is one. It's not always the case, but this is one example where there is actually quite a close connection between the artificial neural networks and the brain. Now, so we talked about image classification and segmentation. So what about generation? So up until recently, the best method for image generation was based on an idea called adversarial training. So you have an artist that's generating, you have a set of real images, and you have an artist that's generating images, and then you have a critic, and the critic is trained to try to distinguish the real images from the fake images, but at the same time the artist is being trained to try to produce images that will fool the critic. So there's this kind of game going on between the artist and the critic, and in particular this was used in something called generative adversarial networks. So you have what we call a deconvolutional network that generates an image. It's kind of the reverse of the previous architecture. You put some numbers in here, and you go through, and it makes an image. That's the artist, or the generator, and then the critic is kind of the same thing in reverse. Yeah, so you've got two neural networks competing against each other. And this is some examples of images that were generated using this technology of faces. So they're pretty good. They're pretty sharp. They look pretty accurate. Occasionally you get mistakes. You know, you might have a person with 6 fingers instead of 5, or other things like that. But generally it was quite good. And this concept of adversarial training can be used in some other ways as well. This is some work that I did a few years ago generating artworks. In this case, the artist is something else that's called a genetic program, but the critic is still a neural network. So you can use it for this kind of fun stuff like this. And there are other things you can do with these convolutional networks. For example, there's this technique called neural style transfer, where you combine the content of one image with the style of another image, and you can produce something that looks like a painting based on a photograph. Anyway, these GANs were the kind of top method up until about a year ago, or 1 or 2 years ago. The latest method for image generation is something called stable diffusion. roughly speaking, it works as follows. Like you start with an image and you gradually corrupt the image. You add, you shrink it, you dilute it a bit, and then you add some noise, and then you kind of repeat the process and repeat the process, and eventually you just end up with white noise. And so what you try to do here is you try to get a network to learn to do the reverse process. You know, that you start with noise and denoise it, and then when it gets to here, it's sort of like just filling in the details. Yeah, so, I mean, there's a lot of work. Originally, this was very unstable, and a lot of things had to be done to make it stable, but modern image and video generation mostly is based on this idea of stable diffusion. Now, in terms of language, I mean, can't really go into too many details here, and also with language, like I said, it's probably quite different from what's really happening in the brain, but for a long time there were these things called recurrent neural networks. So it was sort of similar to the neural networks from the 1980s and 90s, but you keep feeding you feed a sequence of inputs in there, you know, a sequence of words or a sequence of phonemes, and the network like keeps updating. And you can, originally it was like a recurrent neural network, and then there was something called a long short-term memory that makes it a bit more sophisticated. And this is actually what Google was using for its machine translation in 2014. It was, they had, 8 layers and all this kind of stuff. It was more bigger, but it was based on this kind of technology. But more recently, we have something called a transformer. And this is a really kind of weird thing that not many people really understand how it works, but basically it looks for correlations. It makes use of correlations between different parts of the input. So if you're feeding it language, instead of feeding it one word at a time, you feed it, 16 words at a time, or bigger context. So you have a group of 16 words, and then a group of 64 words, and then a group of 1,024 words. And you have this kind of hierarchical structure where it somehow is able to learn, or this word here correlates with that word, even from the previous sentence or whatever. It processes so much data that it can extract out these correlations. So, and there's just, in some ways it's memorization in a sense, but a kind of deep, sophisticated form of memorization. And this is the this is the language transformer, and there's also like a vision transformer and like phoneme transformers. So a lot of this stuff now is based on transformers. Okay, so that's just kind of an overview to give you some idea what these models are built on. So now I'd want to just sort of discuss some of the challenges of this. So obviously this is great technology. It's making all sorts of new things possible, but it does raise some issues. Now, some of these I'll talk a little bit more detail. Some of them I'll just quickly mention. So first is the issue of energy consumption. These transformer models, they use up a lot of energy, and it's in my opinion, probably the similar results could theoretically be obtained with much less energy consumption. And in fact, that's kind of what these DeepSeek people did in China. They were blocked from having access to the largest chips, and so they were forced to try to do things more efficiently. But if you think about it, there's kind of a perverse incentive here. Well, this is linked to another question. There's this debate, like, will AI become centralized or decentralized? In one scenario, a small number of mega companies will control all the software and everyone will have to go through them. In the alternate scenario, maybe it'll be more diversified and a larger number of companies involved. And this, at the moment, this small number of companies, it's not in their interest for there to be research into more efficient models, because as long as they make people believe that you need huge computers to do all this, then they can maintain their monopoly. Yeah, so there's a very interesting issue there. There's also issues about surveillance and control. Yeah, I don't know if you go to like Shenzhen in China, you get on the bus, you don't have to buy a ticket or anything because a camera will just recognize your face, where you get on, where you get off, and it'll automatically charge you, right? You better not cross the street against the red light because a camera will recognize you and you'll be fined. Yeah, so there's huge concerns about this. Education. Yeah, I'm involved in education. So to be honest, most students have a pretty good attitude about this, but we do have a minority of students who are becoming lazy and just using ChatGPT to do their essays and all this kind of stuff. So that's an issue too. We were just discussing about, I don't know, can't really go into all this, but AI warfare. What's going to happen if some rich countries start using robots to fight their wars instead of humans? And some people have raised the issue that AI could even pose an existential threat. I think recently some studies in OpenAI and Anthropic, under controlled conditions, they have demonstrated that some of these like agentive AIs that can make their own decisions will actually like use very devious means to avoid getting shut down. Okay, let me just talk about these other three issues in a bit more detail. So fake news. I gave a talk to this group 4 years ago, I think, but again, the technology has just massively moved on since then. Where I pointed out fake images are as old as photography itself. Like as early as the 1860s, people would take a picture of someone on a horse and stick it on a fake another background, and stick someone's head on the body of another person. So this kind of thing is very old, and it's a more recent example, the Cottingley fairies. To us, this seems very, very hokey, but somehow this fooled people as sophisticated as Arthur Conan Doyle, right? Now, in terms of the deep fake technology, it really started at SIGGRAPH in 1997. A demonstration was made where you could sort of create fake video of John F. Kennedy like singing a song or saying some weird stuff. It was pretty primitive by modern standards, but everyone was kind of talking about this at the time, like what this is going to lead to. And then you have all these advances in the movie industry with motion capture, both of the body and the face itself. But this was still pretty expensive. And then you get to this video generation. Now, I wanted to show that this is just, like I say, the technology is advancing all the time. So, but this video is just from last week, so I just wanted to show you, to give you an idea of the sophistication of what's going on here.
Like
Like,
healthy, I'm working out harder than I ever thought I could.
I think we may have some trouble with the sound, but maybe I just hold the microphone here. Yeah. Yeah.
Remember, Jane Fonda always.
Hang on.
Go for the burn, sweat. Get that chin up.
Can you hear it?
That's all you got. Pick up the pace.
Yeah. I mean,
I was a lead engineer on the Optinox 5.
I won't go through all of this, but this is a good video because they actually explain how it was made. You know, they select, they use a system to select the characters. They just kind of often just type in a prompt, and you know, I want a robot with that's blue and white with, you know, big eyes or whatever, and it comes back with various candidates, and you pick the one you prefer, and then you can use other tools to actually animate it. And all of this is fake. The streetscape is artificially generated as well, and then they use motion capture and voice capture here.
To optimize workplace efficiency. And we uploaded the image and the video of
so
the runway restyle.
So they create a character, and then they get the character to mimic the actions and the words of the actor. They do have some bloopers as well. So, but you can see, like, this is, they said they did this like for $1,000. They made this video, and sorry, just go back here. And there are some bloopers here. Like, this is actually like somehow the human. This image was this sequence was supposed to have a human and a robot, but somehow because of the stable diffusion, somehow the two got merged together. So you got a robot with a human head sticking out in the front. Yeah. So this kind of weird stuff can happen. Yeah. So as I said, you can see that this creates like massive opportunities. Yeah, like lots and lots of people can create things cheaply and easily that would have taken a lot of resources before. But it's also going to take away jobs from people. So it creates jobs and destroys jobs. And this issue, you can see that this issue was even raised in the 1960s Jetsons, because George Jetson, somehow he had enough resources to fill his house with fancy gadgets, and he did go to the office every day, but he didn't have anything to do there. He just had to press a button to start the system. So they identified the problem back then, but didn't tell us, you know, the solution. And I think that this is this is a, I mean, I think it's not just an issue of economics here, but an issue of kind of sociology, because these are still images from one of those cheesy educational videos from the 1950s for children, where they're explaining how a community works. You know, like one person bakes the bread and one person delivers the mail, and everyone sort of does something to help out the other people. There's this whole wonderful kind of quaint notion about community. And, well, it's true that many of these jobs have been automated already or partially automated, So some people would argue, well, it's just the boring jobs that are going away, but all these, technology will create new jobs. Now, to understand this, this is meant to be, if you allow this analogy, the river is meant to represent jobs that have already been automated, and the land represents jobs that humans are still doing. So the situation we've had up until now is as depicted on the left-hand side of this slide, that yes, the river is constantly rising, but because the land is steeply sloped, it's easy for the humans to just move up to higher ground. There's always going to be territory for the humans away from the river. But many commentators are now saying that the current situation might be more what's depicted on the right, that this land might actually be relatively flat. So then as the river rises, it can actually inundate a lot of land quickly, and the humans may have to run very fast to stay on dry land, and there may not be enough space for all of them, right? So whether you're a kind of techno-optimist or pessimist more or less comes down to which of these two pictures you believe in, right? But I think there's also the issue, and if I can just give my own thoughts on this. I mean, some people have said that, well, you think about the jobs that have been lost. In the early 2000s, photography and journalism kind of disappeared or shrank a lot, but it wasn't because of AI. It was just because of information technology. Everyone had a digital camera, everyone had access to the internet, and so because of that, these jobs shrank and didn't pay as well as before. Now we're moving into visual artists, writers, composers, originally screen actors, and then there was a period where they made animated films, but they still needed humans to do the voices. Now the voice technology is getting so good that may not be needed either. So there's sort of this steady erosion. And some people say, well, it's mainly the creative industries, that we have to protect. Somehow it's okay for the others to go. But my view is that really every job has some level of many jobs have some level of creativity involved. If you're an educator or a lawyer or a business analyst, you've been kind of writing, there's some content creation involved. You write memos, you write summaries, and it gives you a sort of sense of agency, and those things may gradually go as well. And if just to put this in a historical context, before the invention of the assembly line, making a motor car was a kind of artisanal occupation. A group of 4 or 6 people would build an entire car themselves, and they do everything, the headlights, the chassis, the wheels, and everything, and they took pride in their work. Now, Henry Ford invented the assembly line, and it made things much more efficient, but the original people who worked in the factories had to leave because they just couldn't psychologically adapt to this new lifestyle, and he had to pay the new people twice as much money to do these jobs. Now, in a way, of course, it's a really good thing, right? The people got a good wage, and people could afford a car, but the nature of the work changed a lot, And the same thing is happening in a lot of sort of analogous things are happening in a lot of other industries. I have a friend who in the early 2000s was working for the Australian Stock Exchange, and he designed and built a web-based system to do stock trading. You know, he designed it and wrote it all himself. He wrote it in Java and C++, and he knew how the whole thing worked. Like, starting from the 2010s, nobody worked like that anymore. Like, you would sort of describe roughly what you want, and then some system would create a lot of modules and classes, and we could create a huge amount of code pieces, most of which you didn't need, and then your job was to kind of put them together. And now it's moving into even the next phase with AI, where you know, the system will just kind of write the code for you, and then your job will be to kind of tidy things up and check that it does what it should and check the mistakes. And to be honest, I've even noticed this in my own life. I mean, two years ago, I was sitting in a cafe with my daughter, and this guy came up to me and I said, "Oh, did you teach data structures and algorithms at UNSW?" And I was like, "My God, that was 18 years ago." And he said, "Oh, that was the best course I ever took," you know, all this. And I'm kind of glad that my daughter was there to see this, because it's like a window on a lost world. Because these days, I mean, in those days, if you could give a good lecture, if you could do a good series of lectures about a topic, people appreciated that. You know, that was like a special skill. And now it's like people don't appreciate it anymore, because like there's tons of stuff on YouTube. If people don't want to come to my lecture, they can watch my old lectures on YouTube, they can watch someone else's lectures on YouTube. It's not scarce anymore, it's not like a special skill. And this is happening, so now like students aren't that interested in that aspect of it, they're more interested in that the assignment doesn't have any mistakes in it, and that it gets marked on time, and these kind of administrative issues, you know. And I think there's a shift like this in a lot of jobs that could end up like this in the future. That a lot of these jobs, it may shift from creating things to just kind of checking and verification, and that may require a substantial psychological shift. And you could compare it to the, I mean, sorry, just more analogies, but another PhD student of mine, like 2 years ago, he started working for some company doing data analysis. And he said even then, in 2023, if you could look at some data and know what kind of analysis to apply to it, that was a valuable skill. But now, by 2024, he would just put the data into ChatGPT and what analysis do you recommend? So it's like in the pre-industrial world, people who were very strong had a privileged position in society. The Industrial Revolution like took someone of average strength and lifts them up to the same level as a very strong person. This revolution could do the same thing. It could take someone of average intelligence and education and lift them up to the same level as someone of high education. So it's sort of it's people who it's an issue of people's self-worth. Another thing, a friend of mine, I mentioned about Kasparov and Deep Blue. A friend of mine actually went to watch the last game between Kasparov and Deep Blue. You know, she was living in New York. Her father was a big chess enthusiast. He was visiting. They went and watched the game. They went and spoke to Kasparov afterwards and asked him for his autograph. They said he was visibly shaken. He was shocked. In 1996, he was shocked that a computer had beaten him at chess. Yeah. So I don't want to be kind of gloomy, but this does raise kind of very interesting issues. And I particularly like this picture here. You know, Charlie Chaplin was decades ahead of his time. It just conveys the idea that he's not in control anymore. You know, the machine is, the other things are dictating, and all he's doing is like, you know, making small adjustments and verifying. That's the other thing. A lot of my job these days is verification, checking that people have the right visa requirements to be able to work, checking that they've worked the right number of hours, checking that all the right topics are covered in the degree program and so on. That's one area. People still want humans to do the verification because for legal reasons. You know, someone has to check that things are compliant and that you want to have a human to do it instead of a machine. Yeah, but yeah, this shift from creation to verification could be a massive mental shift. I don't know. So I think I'll just probably just leave it there, but I'm happy to support any questions or further discussion.
Okay, thank you. Alan. Before we move into questions, I'd like to point out that this issue of the magazine that came out in June last year has some articles on evolution, and we used some AI systems to do our front cover. It has a picture of Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace in a nicely tropical location, but inside there's a picture of Darwin sitting down and a lot of people behind him, and one of them has 6 fingers. Now, we cleaned up a lot of the stuff in the image, but we thought, it's an article about evolution. So 6 fingers is not a problem. Okay, any questions? One over here.
I would like to have your comment on how AI deals with the issue of copyright and intellectual property, given the fact that it's known that a lot of the generative AI results are using, say, music from bands and books from writers, ideas from people that have been published before, and they seem to be taken without any type of compensation or consideration to the ownership of that knowledge.
Yeah, look, it's a very good question. Yeah, I can't claim to be an expert on this, but I know there's debates going on in Britain right now about this. There's a bill bouncing back and forth between the House and the Commons and the Lords. I think with, well, I should mention this. One of the things about these transformers, I said that they do memorization. In a sense, what they do is it's referred to as one-shot learning. In fact, the original paper describing GPT-2 literally uses the phrase one-shot learning. And so if you ask for it to generate something, I think it will combine whatever exists. Like if there's 20, if you ask it for an essay on a certain topic, if it's been trained with 20 essays on that topic, it'll come up with some sort of mashup that combines all of them. But if there's only 1 or 2, it'll just merge those 2 kind of thing. So they do have this ability that if someone creates a new artwork in a new style, let's say, they can actually incorporate that into their repertoire pretty quickly. Yeah, so there is, and then, yeah, so theoretically, if the training set only, I don't know, if an artist has a very distinct style, they probably have a good argument to claim that. First of all, let me start with images. If the law ends up being very strict on this, there are some very large image repositories like Getty Images, and it is possible that AI companies might train models confining themselves to images that they definitely have copyright access to. You know, they may be able to do that. With language and artworks and so on, it's not that easy. And yeah, I mean, like I say, like if an artist has a very distinctive style and then it produces an artwork in that style, I think they would have a fairly strong argument that it's been like copied in some sense. But if there's multiple artists with similar styles, then it could become harder to make that argument. It becomes more diffuse. And the voice one is interesting. You know, like if a person has, this issue with, you know, the voice from her or whatever. I mean, if an actor has one very distinctive voice, and then someone makes a movie mimicking that voice, I think you could argue that it's a breach of copyright. But if you have an actor who uses 5 different voices in different movies, can they really claim ownership of all of them? Yeah, I don't know.
It also comes down to actually there is the fact that actually you can copy someone's cartoon. We used to be able to if you redrew it.
Right.
So people have a cartoon like in a newspaper, the old-fashioned cartoon with a joke. If you redrew it, they didn't have copyright on that. They had copyright on their drawing. But the other issue was that George Lucas, when he made the first Star Wars film, bought the image rights to Carrie Fisher. So he owned what she looked like. And in later Star Wars films, she was used as a CGI, created as a CGI thing, and I don't think there was any comeback. She was dead by then anyway. But yeah, there's a very vexed area actually. Questions? Right down the back. This is where we get exercise.
Thank you. I had a question. You mentioned that there's been cases of students using AI. I was just wondering what your view on students using it, using like ChatGPT as an accessibility tool. What like that kind of opinion on it would be, because I know that there are a lot of barriers for people with disability, whether it's intellectual, physical, even age can be a barrier in people going to university. So because it is very helpful in some situations, so what's your opinion on that?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think, so I teach, computer courses, obviously. I think for us, well, I have noticed the last couple of years, like when I set assignments, certain questions, I tend to get a lot of very similar wrong answers, which kind of have the smell of ChatGPT to them. And like in our case, we rely heavily on having a supervised exam. I mean, don't want to be. I've had an ongoing fight with the university. They keep pushing us to not have supervised exams, at least for large classes, but all the classes that we teach are large. And it's, so far I've managed to have a supervised exam, but sometimes they really punish me by making me supervise it myself and spreading the students over 13 different buildings, and that's another story. But the supervised exam is very important. But for I think this is more of an issue in the humanities, and I think they're struggling with it. And some people have actually set exercises where you get a response from it. You're supposed to get a response from ChatGPT and then critique it, which could work, but the systems are getting better and better, and a friend of mine who's an English teacher says that Claude does a better job than than ChatGPT for English essays and has improved a lot in the last year. So it's really a kind of moving goalposts, and also it depends on the size of the class. I think if the class is small, then you can kind of do that kind of exercise and really spend more time with each student. If you've got a really large class, it's hard to do that. And then, yeah, I think I've heard in the US some students are complaining, some students are complaining that the lecturers are using AI to generate assignment questions and generate slides and maybe do part of the marking too. So then they're complaining, well, if you're allowed to use it, we should be allowed to use it too.
Okay, I think we have to cut the questions down a bit. We have one more here.
Just going back to Transformers, would you believe that is the reason why Google is how it is now? I remember trying to Google something even a decade ago. It was significant. I could just Google the things I want with the key phrases, and now the algorithm is pushing something. I can't actually Google what I want to Google anymore. The learned skills that I have in that particular field is now obsolete because the algorithm now pushes what the algorithm believes I want to see. And also, would you believe that just the Transformers in itself, with its existence and its learning patterns within AI, does it just compound social and moral issues within human systemic society as it is? Because it's just feeding me what I want to see, not what I'm actually wanting to know.
A good question. Well, first of all, that AI summary at the top of the Google search is often erroneous. Yeah, I didn't show, but I had.
But also the links and also the referred material.
Some people say it's really just that they're getting greedy. They have the sponsored links, and then the others. Yeah, I mean, it's basically about revenue maximization. Yeah, a lot of people are. I mean, I think it's probably true. The quality of the Google search has deteriorated, and some people have said there are other search engines that you pay for that do a better job. I haven't tried them myself, but it sounds plausible. But yeah, that's a good point too. We've just this whole, not just Google search, but Google Maps. There are coffee shops that it's not showing you. Is it because they don't know about them, or is it because they didn't pay? Yeah, I don't know. There's issues there too. Yeah.
It's scary when Google starts answering your question when you haven't finished writing. One last question over here. One last.
Yeah, just a quick one. As of yesterday, stock valuations, NVIDIA is back on top again against Microsoft and Apple. How long is it going to be there before it really starts heading south and someone else takes over?
Good question. I can't claim specific expertise about this, but those Chinese guys, if they're being blocked access, they'll be trying to develop their own chips and maybe even more efficient chips, and I don't know how long that process is going to take, but I guess maybe that's the bigger threat to NVIDIA. But there's also, the other issue that I mentioned, if people manage to develop other algorithms that are more efficient. This may sound like a stretch, but DEC in the 1970s, Digital Equipment Corporation were kind of on top because they made the mainframe computers, and when the home PC came out, that just totally cut away their market share. It is conceivable the same thing might happen with AI. That if it can be done with simpler, cheaper chips, then its market share may not be justified. I don't know what probability to put on that, but that is a possible scenario, I think.
Okay, I think we have to call it quits there for the questions. Would you please join with me in thanking Alan Blair? Thank you. There's a lot of questions.